Welcome to the Perspective Knoll, a channel that creates audiobooks from original stories and including some fan fiction short stories in between. If this is something you're into, then feel free to like and subscribe so that you don't miss any of our new content.
Chapter 24. The Fairy Caretaker. Chrono, Marla, and Charles had made their way to the end of the barracks to the only way in or out of that building. There was the small area by the entrance where the guards spent most of their shift, but whatever ones were there were now scattered in pieces. It was one awful, gruesome sight, and Charles knew that Anthony had literally torn these poor men apart. Chrono was about to leave when he paused while looking at one of the bodies. He then stepped close to it and knelt. "We could use this armor," he spoke while never having his eyes leave what he was examining. "It might be best to use a disguise instead of running in with the Gorferndain colors. We shouldn't make it too obvious for them." Namaric had just entered the room with Laurie, Ro, and Jode. "By the Creator, this is awful. These poor men," said Jode with wide eyes and his mouth open in horror. "They didn't deserve a death like this." Chrono looked at his squad and gave the order, "Find one that fits you. It looks like 3 sets, it's hard to tell, but nonetheless we." Chrono was soon interrupted. "There's another room here and it's filled with additional armor and weapons too." Marla called out from a doorway on the left side of the room. It appeared to be a small changing area for the guards and a place to sharpen their weapons as well as cleaning supplies. "All right then, suit up," commanded Chrono. The armor that they had grabbed was mostly made of leather. Ro, Jode, and Marla had used black rags to cover their faces, and to Charles they now looked more like bandits from an old western, ready to rob a bank. They also put on the hoods of their cloaks so that at first glance, you could barely make out their eyes, yet alone the color of their skin. Chrono and Namaric took a liking to the chain mail and had strapped on pieces of plate mail over their shoulders and chest and head. It wasn't much longer that they all had their own armor on except for Laurie. She thought it was best that she didn't need anything like that, and as far as anyone knew, she was just another tourist in the city. Yet Marla warned her that technically there were no tourists in the city at the time of war. But Laurie was stubborn and wasn't going to wear the armor, and that was final. Before leaving the guard station, Charles searched all the surrounding places more than twice for his crossbow. It simply wasn't there, and it only meant one possible scenario, and that was that Captain Brennan still had it in his possession. No matter what, Charles did not feel like going into the castle unarmed, so he took a couple of daggers and sheathed them to his new belt. Chrono, as he usually did, took the lead, and had Marla and Charles follow him out of the dungeons and up the stairs. Namaric was walking at Chrono's side and talking in a hushed tone. Once at the top of the stairs, Namaric looked back and waved for Ro, Laurie, and Jode to come up to him. They all said their farewells and good lucks, and Laurie hugged Charles. "I have a bad feeling about what's going to happen," she told him. "You and me both. We'll be seeing you soon." Charles released his hold on her and walked now with Chrono and Marla. The courtyard was to their left, and just behind that was the castle itself. Charles found it a little odd at first that there was no longer a guard stationed at every entrance of the courtyard, but that was answered by more screams coming from a nearby part of the city. Charles' first thought was, "Man, Anthony must be giving them hell," but another thought quickly took over. Or they were giving him hell. He shook it out of his mind and continued behind the elves and to the stony steps that lead to the main doors of the castle. Once more, Charles found no one was at their post, and the three pushed inside. There was a low tan-colored ceiling with an emerald border that was designed to look like vines with large petals reaching outward. There were a few torches, unlit upon the walls, and a few small cross-shaped windows allowed most of the light within the hall. Further along the corridor, they came across a section of the ceiling that grew nearly 30 feet tall. Large pillars now stretched upward to hold the ceiling. There was a large painting that covered the entire area, and it was that of King Uriel in his tree-like form, and he was surrounded by small fairies, and he appeared to be telling them a story. "How sure are you that the intel you received was accurate and that we won't be heading into a trap?" Charles asked as he was still craning his neck to admire the detail within the massive painting which very much reminded him of the famous painting in the 16th chapel. Our informant hasn't let us astray yet. Seems odd that she would now. Chrono answered, not bothering to even turn around to look at Charles or stop in general. He just pushed onward, and now they came upon a wide spiral staircase. Have you ever heard of a double agent? Charles wondered out loud and didn't mean to be a question for the captain. Chrono paused mid-step and then breathed in deep. He turned and walked straight to Charles to where their faces may have only been a few inches apart. I trust my orders, human. As I have always done, Chrono spoke in a low, powerful tone. I question everything I hear. I know that plans change. This intel we are going off of is nearly a week old, and without a doubt, something will play a part that wasn't in the original plan. That's why we adapt. That's what we do. Chrono turned and continued back up the stairs, and when Charles looked to Marla, the elf merely gave him a light slap on the arm and pressed on. From that moment on, Charles knew that he had to watch his tongue around these elves. He wouldn't have questioned any other country's military before, and just because he was in another realm, he should still treat the military here the same way. As they climbed, there was a door on each level leaving the staircase. Charles wondered what lay just beyond those doors, and if whatever was on the other side could imagine a pair of Gorferndain elves, accompanied by a lawman running around the halls of their castle. Chrono then stopped once they had reached the third level and slowly opened one of the double wooden doors. He peeked inside the hallway and listened for any oncoming footsteps or voices. He soon turned and told them it was clear to press on. As instructed, they walked up to the second door on the right and stopped. Chrono had yet again begun to whisper. This should be it. The chamber that holds the fairies when they are not out doing errands. I don't know what to expect on the other side, but you both have to be ready. I mean ready. We might be attacked as soon as we pass through, so if that happens, we start swinging. We do not submit. Chrono then looked to Marla, and he reached for the handle, which was surprisingly unlocked. He then removed his helmet, and Marla had too taken off her face mask and pulled off her hood. We don't need our view obscured once we get beyond this door. Chrono moved to the other side of Marla so that he would be the first one to breach the room. Chrono held out his crossbow, and Charles desperately wished that he had his as well. Marla, on the other hand, had pulled out a pair of twisted daggers and then gave Chrono a head nod to let her captain know that she was ready. Chrono kicked the door the rest of the way and moved quickly into the room, and Marla was on his heels, and Charles, although hesitant, pulled out his daggers and entered the room too. Once inside, there was a large desk off to the right, and the room had a cool blue glow about it. There were steel cages hanging from chains that were anchored to the tall ceiling. The cages were emptied, but Charles remembered that fairies could turn invisible. Also inside the room was a mirror made up of silver, and there were amber gems placed throughout the frame. They pulsed with light from within themselves, and Charles got a bad feeling about it. In the corner of the large room was a bed that rested below a tall window and a wardrobe cabinet that matched the framework of the bed. There was an oval-shaped rug with a rocking chair and a small coffee table that sat in front of the hearth. Sleeping on the job, my dear? Asked Chrono, and at first Charles had no idea who he was talking to, but then realized that an older woman had her head on the desk and was sleeping. Marla then touched her on the shoulder, and the woman jolted violently. Who the? What are you? The woman stopped when she realized that she was now staring at a pair of Gorferndain elves and a human. She leaned back in her chair and swallowed hard, and she was clearly about to panic. Are you known as the fairy caretaker? Asked Chrono with his crossbow still pointed at the woman's face. She looked instead to Charles and avoided Chrono's question completely. You aren't one of them, how did you get roped up into this? She asked. Marla then brought the back of her hand hard to the woman's face, and she fell off her chair and landed on the floor. Chrono gave his squad mate a look, and Marla merely shrugged in response. Charles, on the other hand, moved around to the woman, and just before he was going to kneel and help her up, some force had pulled him by his arms and took him into the air. Charles was now being raised high above the room and suddenly was thrown into one of the swinging cages, and when it shut hard, what had him revealed itself. A fairy in a yellow dress was looking at him with great disgust and then locked him in. Marla, who saw the fairy, took aim with one of her daggers and hurled it through the air, yet before it struck, the dagger literally turned to a puff of smoke and dissipated. Then Marla herself was next to be picked up and placed into a cage by another unseen force, but before the cage closed, Chrono had taken aim and, with a well-calculated guess, and shot just in front of the cage. There was a sound of flesh being sliced through, and for a split second, the dart had disappeared but re-emerged through something and struck the far wall. Immediately after the arrow had passed through its invisible target, a fairy had appeared and was now free falling to the floor. The woman shouted in disbelief. Yet as she did, about a dozen other fairies had appeared around the room. Oh shit! Charles was filled with fear, and he knew that his end was on the horizon. Any moment a fairy was going to strike him down while in the cage, and there, his body would rot. More than likely be a meal or two for some strange bird creature that was kept hidden away somewhere in the castle. You killed Nehada! The woman shrieked, and she rushed now to the fairy on the floor. Chrono looked at the woman and he felt that his doom was too at hand, and he believed that this was actually how things were going to go. Are you Karen? He asked with his bow still held up to his face with his eyes still locked through the sights. The woman looked at him with a rage like none had seen before. Her face twisted in a cold and dark manner. Her eyes began to glow an amber color. She stood now and put a hand up to the end of Chrono's crossbow, and Chrono fired. The dart went straight through her hand and then struck her shoulder, where it plunged deep. Yet there was no expression on the woman's face that indicated pain whatsoever. Yes, to answer your question, elf. I am Karen, the fairy caretaker. Now do you know what you are about to be? She then grabbed the crossbow with such a force, with the hand that now had a hole in it, and stripped it from Chrono's grip. Karen tossed it to the floor and, with that same hand, pulled the dart from her shoulder. She then sniffed the end of the dart and frowned. Shame, you should have used a poisoned dart. Karen? A voice suddenly echoed off the walls that belonged to no one, and the very next moment, a ghost of a man had appeared. My wife, is that you? Charles looked down, and below him, he could see that the spirit of Dale Shepherd had appeared and was looking at Karen very much like it was his long-lost wife. Karen herself paused within time and purely froze in disbelief. Her eyes no longer glowed, and her face went straight to tears as she slowly made her way to him. Dale, however, gave her a look and it made her pause. What happened to you? Dale asked, and the expression he wore was of surprise and disapproval. Karen was choked up and had a hard time keeping the tears from rolling down her cheeks. It's been such a lonely time without your handsome face and awesome sense of humor. After I returned to our little town of Arrowhead in 923C, I found out from your friend Marvin that you had passed in my absence. I wasn't even there when you were buried. Yeah, it was no picnic, dying and all that. Truth be told, I missed you. Well, I still miss you terribly. It has its perks, being a ghost. I can vanish and reappear whenever I feel like it, so scaring folks is kind of fun. You might say it's my favorite pastime. Dale smirked and looked up at Charles, and he knew exactly what he meant. I was actually chosen to watch over Charles Woods, the man that is now up in the cage there. Karen, now looking very confused, heartbroken, and excited all at once, asked, Who said you had to watch over him? Prince Insonnol. Dale answered, and both Marla and Chrono were shocked. Our prince, said Chrono in disbelief. He brought your spirit back to this plane just to protect that man. Chrono was now pointing upwards towards the cage. Yes, Dale simply said, and he took his pipe out and began smoking it like he normally did. Wow. Even in death, you're still smoking? Asked Karen, but she didn't seem angry but instead wore a smile and was genuinely pleased to see her husband, in the exact way that she remembered him. I just want to be able to hug and kiss you again. If I was granted any one wish, that would be all I desire. But looking at you now, in person, is the greatest gift I never thought, in a million years, that I would have received. You know, if ghosts could blush, I'm surely doing it now, Dale said, and everyone could tell that he was holding back tears of his own. The fairies all glided down to their caretaker, and all patted her on the back and gave her a hug. Charles was so confused by the sudden turn of events. He was sure that he and Chrono and Marla were dead, and then the next moment, they were watching the union of this married couple who didn't get the chance to say goodbye before the other passed away in life. Do you remember those times out on the sailboat? Karen asked, still slowly moving her way closer to him. You mean like the trip to Cape Corahoon? Dale was trying to recall what she meant. That's right, Cape Corahoon, she nodded and smiled greatly. I might be dead, but I still have my memories, Dale responded in a joking manner. Yes, I remember Cape Corahoon. So much Lufforain history there. You know I still think about you all the time and those are great memories. But do you know what my best memories were of? They were just being with you, it didn't matter where we went. Those times when we would bicker back and forth and it sounded like to others that we were arguing, but really, we were just having fun with one another. Those memories that didn't cost anything and that we could get every day as long as we were in each other's company. Karen was trying so hard to compose herself. You made me laugh all the time. I loved your funny stories like your super salesman story. We got cheated out of many more years we should have spent together. Maybe I wouldn't have taken this job and worked for these horrible creatures here. What do you mean? Dale asked. King Uriel and Queen Memphia are using me to guide the fairies to help get what they want. What they want is to take over the world through the Leo Mandarin paintings. While the conversation was going on down below, Charles wondered if he was going to get help getting out of his cage. Even if he was able to get it unlocked, the fall surely would break a bone or two if he tried to jump from that height. He looked over at Marla and she seemed to be calculating the same thing. Just then, there was a tap on Charles' shoulder and when he turned around, nothing was there. Hello again, Charles. Came a voice and soon, the fairy Argatha had materialized in front of him. Can we talk?